Okay, so we're going to pick up with one last incident from Saul's life. It is not the last incident in the account of Saul and the transition of power from Saul to David, but I think it's significant and quite interesting. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so this is after the death of Samuel, and the whole people of Israel is lamenting for him, and he's buried in Ramah. And then we get this side note. Saul had forbidden recourse to ghosts and familiar spirits in the land. This is actually something that we see in the book of Leviticus. If you wanted to look at it, it's Leviticus 19, where the Torah explicitly forbids going to Ov and Yidonim, two different kinds of mediums. Uh, and Saul had forbidden it. It's not clear why. We're just told about it here. And it will be, as you'll see, quite sufficient, quite important. Um, I want to also mention that this idea of going to a necromancer gets treated in the Talmud, a section called Sanhedrin, that tractate. And there we learn some details, not to say that it really, those Talmudic details apply here. We're going to see, in fact, clear differences. But I thought you should know just because it's intriguing and somewhat amusing. So if you were to go to, and and the rabbis and this text too seems to believe that this is possible, that you could consult the spirits of the dead. It is forbidden to do so. It's kind of pagan, actually, and it's setting up really a different realm as opposed to God. God too can be consulted. God is consulted through prophets, or in the time of the Torah, there are the Urim and Tumim, these divination devices, which are on the worn on the breastplate of the high priest. So it's not that attempting to divine the future is forbidden. This is a way of doing it, which is much more tied to paganism and seems to be an affront to how God has ordained. At any rate, the Talmud tells us how this works. So the medium who you consult will bring up the voice of the dead, and the voice will you'll hear the voice in one of three ways. The first is that we'll speak from under the medium's armpit or from a bone that's placed in the mouth or directly from the ground. And if it comes from the ground, it's extremely faint, difficult to hear. Um, there is a sense that the medium perhaps sees an apparition. It's always upside down. So for what it's worth, and I don't know how the Talmud, it's very fanciful. I don't know why or how they say this, but there it is. And I wanted to mention it because you'll see how much it contrasts with what we're going to see here. So in verse 4, the Philistines had mustered as they marched to Shunem and encountered. And Saul gathers all of Israel, and they are at Gilboa. So here's Saul, the king who is the military leader, among other things. That is, in fact, why the king was chosen. They said, as you'll remember, that we want to be like other people. But there's also a sense that Saul or the king will be able to gather the entire people, not just one or two tribes, as we had seen, for example, in the time of Judges, but the whole people, and they go to Gilboa. Now, obviously, the whole people means the fighting forces. And Saul sees the Philistine force. His heart trembles with fear, and he inquires of God, but God does not answer him either by dreams or Urim or by prophets. Yeah, I forgot to mention dreams. God does appear in dreams, and we see that even in the Torah itself, principally, of course, symbolically in the time of Joseph. And even before that, as we look at the patriarchs, they seem to, at night, hear God's words. So Samuel, now Shaul rather, says to his courtiers, find me a woman who consults ghosts so that I can go to her and inquire through her. He wants to know what he should do, essentially. Um, the prophet, for example, might well advise the king about how this is to be handled. He can't seem to, in the name of God, and he can't seem to get that. So this, of course, is in direct violation of the fact that Saul has banished these people. And he's so desperate here that he wants to find her. And he hears that there is a woman in Endor who consults ghosts. They apparently searched out this information because it's illegal to do this. Um, she is known, it's not called that here, but uh, traditionally she's referred to as the witch of Endor. So he disguises himself. He puts on different clothes and he sets out with two men, and they come to the woman by night. He says, please divine for me a ghost. Bring up for me the one who I will name to you. And here she replies, not knowing that she's talking to Saul. She says, you know the situation, how Saul has banned the use of ghosts and familiar spirits in the land. So why are you laying a trap for me to be killed? So there are three men. She could easily imagine that she's going to be seized and perhaps killed. Um, and now Saul swears to her, Chai Adonai, as God lives, you won't get into trouble over this. And so she accepts that and she says, who shall I bring up? Which ghost do you wish to consult? And he says, bring up Samuel for me. The woman recognizes Samuel and shrieks loudly. This is not the way things ordinarily work. Presumably, if you want to follow the Talmudic understanding, he's not upside down. And she immediately knows that he's Saul. Now, it's not clear how she knows that. Perhaps who else would be recognized? Who else would want Samuel to come up? Um, Perhaps it's the way he speaks. It's really unclear. The rabbis, in reading this passage, say Samuel is reluctant to come up, but Moses joins him. There's no evidence for that at all, of course. And the king says, don't be afraid. And now he's referred to as the king because there's no reason to hide that fact. And don't be afraid. What do you see? So he does not see. It's only the medium who sees. And she says, I see a divine being coming up from the earth. And so the idea that he is a divine being seems to suggest more than just the appearance of Samuel, that he has been transformed in some way as he has died and essentially received some kind of reward. And Saul, who doesn't see him, says, what does it look like? And she says, it is an old man wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel. He bows low in homage to his face at the ground. And Samuel says to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me and brought me up?" And the English translation here really doesn't do justice to this. He is grouchy, like someone who has just been awakened. He's not happy. And remember that Samuel had rejected Saul. I mean, this is real desperation. Um, and Saul answers, "I am greatly troubled. The Philistines are attacking me, and God has turned away from me, no longer answers me by prophets or in dreams. So I have called you to tell me what I am to do." And Samuel says, "Why do you ask me, seeing that God has turned away from you and has become your adversary?" So, in other words, I was the representative of God. That was I'm not some soothsayer. If God is your adversary, how could you expect me to give you advice? And God has done what was foretold through me. God has torn the kingship out of your hands and given it to your fellow, to David. And we'll see David next, and we'll actually move back in time because you did not obey God and did not execute God's wrath upon the Amalekites. And that, of course, is exactly the last scene that we saw. This is why God has done this to you. And of course, the language here that torn away the kingship, you remember that when Saul heard this, that from Samuel, he tried to go after him, and his robe tore, and that was symbolic of this. Further, God will deliver the Israelites who are with you into the hands of the Philistines. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. That is to say, you will die, and they will die. And God will also deliver the Israelite forces into the hands of the Philistines. At once Saul flings himself on the ground, terrified. Besides, there was no strength in him. He had not eaten all day and all night. This is the first time that we see this. The Perhaps he did this in preparation, some kind of spiritual practice. Uh, the woman went up to Saul, and seeing how disturbed he was, she said to him, "Your handmaid listened to you." That is, she did. "I took my life into my hands and heeded the request. I listened to you. Now listen to me. Let me set before you a bit of food. Eat, and then you will have the strength." So here we see that she really, on the one hand, she didn't want to do it because it was illegal. And here she's compassionate. She is not the villain here, despite the fact that despite what she had done. And the courtiers, that is, the two men who came with him, also urged him. He listened. He got up from the ground. He sat on the bed. She had a stall-fed calf in the house. She slaughtered it, took flour and kneaded it, baked some unleavened cakes. She set it before Saul and his courtiers, and they ate, and they rose and left the same night. So here we really see Saul in his least Saul Saul in the least possible way as a leader. We see what he's been reduced to. We see the consequences of his behavior, the fact that the Israelites are now good, that the Philistines are going to be a plague upon them, and it will only be in the time of David that they are finally subdued. Let me stop the share for a minute. Good morning to those who have joined us. Any any questions or comments about this very strange episode? Anybody at all? The Witch of Endor. Okay. We're going to move on to David and look at some famous scenes in the life of David. And I'm going to start with the moment at which he shows his character, at least an element of his character. He shows himself to be the kind of person who will be a king in Israel. So, sharing once again. Okay. So we're back to the situation where Saul is the king. This is earlier. Philistines assemble their forces for battle. They massed at Sukkot of Judah and at Ephes Damim between Sukkot and Azekah. And Saul and the rest of Israel's side mass and camp in the valley of Elah. And they draw their line of battle against the Philistines stationed on one hill, and Israel stationed on the other, the ravine between them. And so essentially, the battle is going to take place in this ravine. A champion of the Philistine forces stepped forward. He is Goliath of Gath. He's 6 cubits and a span tall. So he's very, very tall. He's a huge man. Um, Remember, Saul is also tall. That's one of the reasons he kind of looked like a king. But Goliath is far taller. He had a bronze helmet on his head, a breastplate of scale armor, a bronze breastplate weighing 5,000 shekels. So this is enormously heavy. He had bronze greaves on his legs, a bronze javelin slung over his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's bar. The iron head of his spear weighed 600 shekels, and the shield bearer marched before him. So he is heavily armored. The ability to wield this spear and to carry this very heavy armor shows him to be incredibly strong. And he calls out to the ranks of Israel, "Why should you come and engage in battle? I am the Philistine champion. You are Saul's servants. Choose your man. Let him come down against me. If he bets me in combat and kills me, we will be your slaves. If I best him and kill him, you will be our slaves." And he ends, "So I now defy the ranks of Israel." It challenges. Give me a man, let's fight it out. When Saul and all Israel heard these words, they were dismayed and terror-stricken. And now we get a picture of David. David was the son of a certain Ephraimite of Bethlehem in Judah. His name was Jesse, so that's David's father. He had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, he was already old. The 3 eldest sons had left and gone with Saul to war, and we get their names, Eliab and Avinadav and Shammah, and David is the youngest. And the 3 oldest had followed Saul. And David went back and forth from attending on Saul to shepherding his father's flock in Bethlehem. And the Philistines stepped forward morning and evening and kept his stand for 40 days. 40, as you know, I think, is a particularly significant number in the Bible. It represents a long time, also a certain sense of completeness. Something is going to happen after 40 days, something of consequence. Think of Moses 40 days and 40 nights, for example, up on Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. So Jesse says to David, father to son, take an ephah of this parched corn, these loaves of bread for your brothers, carry them quickly to your brothers in camp. Take these 10 cheeses to the captain of the thousands. Find out how your brothers are, bring some token from them. So this is exactly what we heard, that David is going back and forth from the flocks to the camp. And here he's bringing supplies to his 3 oldest brothers. Saul and the brothers and everyone else were in the valley of Elah in war against the Philistines, really not in the valley itself, but on the mountains on either side. The next morning, David left someone in charge of the flock, took the provisions, and set out as instructed. He reaches the barricade as the enemy was going out to the battle lines, shouting the roar cry. And Israel and the Philistines draw up their battle lines opposite them. He left his baggage with the men in charge of the baggage and ran to the battle line to greet his brothers. This is actually, I think, quite significant. Remember when Samuel goes to find Saul, Saul is hiding in the baggage. David leaves the baggage and he runs to the battle line. While he's talking to them, the champion stepped forward and spoke the same words as before. This is 40th day. David heard him. When everyone on Israel's side saw the man, they fled in terror. On Israel's side, they were saying, "Did you see that man coming out? He comes to defy Israel. The one who kills him will be rewarded by the king with great riches, and he'll give him his daughter in marriage and grant exemption to his father's house in Israel." Exemption probably meaning from taxes. So they're desperate to find a champion, and no one is coming forth. David asks the man what will be done for the one who kills the Philistine and removes the disgrace from Israel. The disgrace because he's taunting them. And then he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he dares to defy the ranks of the living God?" So here we see David as not only brave, but in some ways he progress. In some ways he is I'm looking for the he is not cowed by Goliath, and he refers to him as uncircumcised. It's worth noting that this is characteristic of the Philistines, but it is not that Israel, the people of Israel, are unique among the nations as people who are circumcised. In fact, it's only the Philistines who are ever referred to as uncircumcised. It seems to be uncommon. And the circumcision, which is done, and you know that it goes back to the time of Abraham, the circumcision, what's significant about the circumcision seems to be that it's done on the 8th day, as opposed to other people who circumcise at other times, and that it has a very particular religious significance of bringing each child into the covenant. The Philistines, it seems, other people are just routinely circumcised for whatever reason. The troops told him in the same words what would be done for the one who kills him. When Eliab, his oldest brother, heard him speaking to the man, he became angry with David, and he said, "Why did you come down here? With who did you leave these few sheep in the wilderness? I know your impotence, your impertinence. You came down to watch the fighting." So he said, "You've deserted our father. You've left your job watching the sheep." He, of course, doesn't know that David has brought supplies for him. And David says, "What have I done? I was just asking." And he turned away from him towards someone else, and he asked the same question, and he got the same answer. So the things David said were overheard and reported to Saul, who had him brought over. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's courage for him. I'll go fight the Philistine." Saul said to David, "You can't go and fight him. You are only a boy. He has been a warrior since his youth," right? So we see David is very young here. He's the youngest of all these children, of all the sons. And David says, "Your servant has been out tending his father's sheep, or if a lion or a bear came and carried the animal off, I would go after it and fight it and rescue it from his mouth. And if it attacked me, I would seize it by the beard and strike it down and kill me. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, bear, the uncircumcised Philistine shall end up like one of them. He has defied the ranks of the living God. And here again, David is emphasizing the fact that the people of Israel believe in the living God and in some sense are supported by God. Although, after all, the Philistines have really been an enormous power in dominating. Uh, and he goes on, the one who saved me from the lion and the bear will also save me from the Philistine. And so he's suggesting, in fact, that he has divine protection and he is standing up before the Philistines as God's representative. And Saul says, go, and may God be with you, because no one else is going. Now Saul clothed David in his garment. He placed a bronze helmet on his head, fastened a breastplate to him, and David girded his sword over his garment. He tried to walk, but he was not used to it. I think there's more than that here. David is a boy. Saul is a man and a very tall man. So you can imagine it's almost a comic scene as David tries to walk. And of course, he can't walk. You imagine the garment, which is down to the ground. He says, I can't walk in these. I'm not used to them. So he takes them off. He took his stick, a few smooth stones from the wadi, put them in the pocket of his shepherd's bag, sling in hand, and he went towards the Philistine. The Philistine's coming closer. He sees David and he scorns him. He was but a lad, ruddy and handsome. And the Philistine called out to David, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? And he cursed David by his gods. And he said to David, come here and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the fields. And David says, you come against me with sword, spear, and javelin. I came against you in the name of the God of hosts, the God of the ranks of Israel, who you have defied. So he's completely uncowed. The Lord of hosts, Adonai Tsevaot, also has a military aspect to it. God's hosts, in some sense, are God's army. Right? So you think you're powerful. I'm far more powerful. God will deliver you into my hands. I will kill you, cut off your head. I will give the carcasses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the earth. All the earth shall know that there is a God in Israel. So he makes this very much about God, and the whole assembly will know God can give victory without sword or spear. The battle is God's. You will be delivered into our hands. So Goliath begins to advance. David runs up to the battle line to face him. He doesn't hang back. And he puts his hand in the bag, takes out a stone, sling, and slung it. It struck the Philistine in the forehead. It sank into his forehead. He fell face down on the ground. Thus, David bested the Philistine with sling and stone, struck him down and killed him. David had no sword, right? He said he would cut off Goliath's head, but he had no sword. He ran up, stood over the Philistine, grasped his sword, pulled it from its sheath, and with it he dispatched him and cut off his head. Remember how heavy the sword is. And so despite David's look, he does seem to be somewhat powerful. And when the Philistines saw it, they ran. And the men of Israel and Judah rose up with a roar cry, and they pursue them, and they fell mortally wounded, and they returned from the Philistines and looted their camp. David took the head, brought it to Jerusalem, and put Goliath's weapon in his own camp. Saul saw it. He asked his army commander, whose son is that young man? He says, I don't know, because David is completely unknown. Saul says, find out. David returns. Abner took him, brought him to Saul with the head of the Philistine still in his hand. Whose son are you? And David answers, the son of your servant, Yishai of Bethlehem. So that's the story, David and Goliath. Um, Comments, thoughts, questions. I think we know something about this from childhood. Oh, Sandy's holding up a picture, I think. Hard to see, but I assume it is this scene. Thanks.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's the same.
All right. Questions, comments, anything about this? Anything about this first sign of David's leadership? Yeah, Barry.
So, this is a very well-known story, and it's usually interpreted as some of the weaker person triumphing over the stronger in
Yes.
terms of physical strength. But it's often occurred to me that this was not a fair fight to use in this on part of David to use the slingshot. This
Um, yeah, I think though, it shows that he's sort of wily, you know. And remember that what Goliath was suggesting wasn't a fair fight either, right? He well knew, I think, that he was more powerful than any individual Israelite. Um, this reminds me, David here reminds me a little bit of Odysseus. He's crafty, um, and he does that which is he catches the enemy off guard by doing something unexpected. Um, but it's not. I like what you said about it not being a fair fight, but I think it's not a fair fight because David is acting in God's name. I think, in fact, Goliath is nothing compared to the Lord of hosts. And I think that's one of the takeaways here. Um, but it appears to be, I think it goes back and forth. And it depends whether you see David in a more secular light or a more religious light. And that is, in terms of David's leadership, that is a basic divide. Sometimes we see him as really a cunning, calculating politician, and sometimes we see him as a deeply religious figure. Uh, Remember that David is many of the Psalms, most of the Psalms are ascribed to David. And in those Psalms, we really see the same kind of religious personality that we're hearing about here. In our last passage about David, uh, which at that point I'm sure Saul will remind us was the Haftorah last week, we will see a very different picture of David. But here he is at the very beginning. And one of the things I really want to contrast, we saw Saul at the beginning reluctant, feeling unworthy, looking like a king, but hiding in the baggage. And here David is a very, very different kind of figure. Other questions or comments, thoughts about this? Anybody at all? Yes, Sandy.
Well, it really does show faith in God. I mean, people, I don't know, people, do they still talk that way? Like, we're going to go in battle because we're going to win because God's on our side. I mean, I guess people do, but it shows pure faith in
I, I,
God.
I think that's right. Um, I think in this particular scene, there is really, I mean, it's also enormous self-confidence. And David seems to feel that he had God on his side. He tells the story about lions and bears, and he, you know, he he seems to believe it. I don't think he's just making this up. On the other hand, when he talks about it, he clearly is exaggerating, grabbing the lion by the mane, right? Clearly not, but he does have a sense. I think here about Joseph. actually. David is very good looking. We're told that, right? Um, and he too seems to have, this is like a patriarchal almost figure where God is with him, blessing him. And we also see that he's an enormously self-confident
Mm.
person as a result of that sense that God is with him. Um, the message is really a message which we have not seen, certainly in early prophets, in the early book of prophets. This sense of being a champion, God's champion. You know, Goliath is the Philistine champion, but David is God's champion. We're going to see some of that also when we get to Elijah. And particularly, there's a scene where Elijah goes up against the prophets of Baal. And we'll see that in a bit. Yeah, Barry.
But these days, God is invoked often for ahead of sporting events.
Yes, but there's a difference, right? So ahead of sporting events, they pray for victory, right? You have that huddle and all of that, but they don't think that God is on their side. It's a request, right? And afterwards, they might say, one of these athletes, winning athlete is perhaps the MVP of the game is being interviewed. And he says, well, we thank God for this victory, right? It's not the same thing, though. I really
Well, I
don't.
mean, I'll often see a player cross himself.
Yeah, yeah.
In-
But again, I don't think they're confident in divine protection. I've always found it kind of amusing in some sense, not because they're crossing themselves, because this idea that God is really interested in, which team wins
Yeah, right.
seems, you can believe in what's called hashgacha pratit in the Jewish tradition, that, God does care about every human being. And perhaps, guides us in our path in life, things like that, that we have free choice. Um, but the idea that God is invested in, whether the Giants win or not, it seems to me almost blasphemous,
Well,
actually.
I watch tennis, and I'll often see a player cross
Yeah,
himself,
yeah.
and it occurs to me that, well, that's not a fair fight. If one side uh, has uh, has God on his side,
Well,
the other
again,
doesn't.
I don't think it means that.
Right? Yeah.
I don't think it means God's on their side. I don't think they think God's on their side. They're saying in
They're
effect,
asking. Yeah.
yeah, they're saying in effect, you know, aid me because I believe in you, right? Here,
Yes. Yeah.
David is saying, I represent that, as opposed to, when the tennis player gets up there, he's not saying, I'm not worried because I represent, Jesus Christ or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
No, he tries to have some confidence going into the match, but it's not the same thing. Okay.
Yeah. I appreciate the difference. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else? Anybody else? Otherwise, we're going to move on and let me do that. And then I share my screen once again. Okay. And now we get a scene. David, one of the things that David does, and this shows him also is different from Saul, he creates a capital for the Israelites in Jerusalem. And there's a wonderful story about how he captures it from the Jebusites. And now he's going to bring the ark to to Jerusalem. He's not he's not going to build the temple. God does not permit that, uh, but he will bring the ark, and presumably the ark will have some structure. It's unlikely that it is the tabernacle created in the wilderness, um, some kind of ark. They load the ark of God onto a cart. It had gone from the Philistines uh, to uh, winding up in the house of Avinadav, and his sons Uzzah and Achio guide the new cart. They convey it to his house on the hill. Uzzah walking alongside the ark of God, and Achio walking in front. David and the whole house of Israel danced before God to the sound of cypress wood instruments, lyres, harps, hand drums, sistrums, and cymbals. Right. So this is a huge, joyous procession. Um, and this also, I think, shows part of David's leadership, as we're going to see even more dramatically. He is identifying himself here. But clearly, this sense of joy and celebration is nothing fake. Now they come to the threshing floor, and Uzzah reaches up for the ark and grasps it, for the oxen has stumbled. Right? So all he's doing is steadying the ark, which is on this ox cart. And God is angry, and he strikes him down, and he died there. And this is really kind of a strange event. It reminds me, I'm sure it reminds you too, of the story of Nadav and Avihu, who offer strange fire on the last day of the consecration of the tabernacle, and they are consumed and die. Um, the idea that God is incensed here, unclear really. It seems to me more like touching the ark in itself is some kind of, in an almost magical way, it kills him. And his intentions are good. Clearly, his intentions are good. Uh, he also was not, at least according to the Torah, only certain people could touch it. And in fact, you may recall, as we think about how the tabernacle was structured, there, in terms of the ark, it had rings on it, and then there were poles that went through the rings, so nobody actually touches it. When the camp moves, as they move from place to place, the tabernacle is taken down, the poles are inserted in the rings, and they're carried. David's distressed, and the place is called Peretz Uzzah, and he was afraid of God that day. He said, "How could I let the ark of God come to me?" So he would not bring it to his place in the city of David. He diverts it to Obed-Edom, who is the Gittite, and it remains there for 3 months. And he and his whole household are blessed. And it's reported to David, and God blessed him and all that belongs to him because of the ark. This is in contrast to what happened when the Philistines capture the ark, and it is taken by them. And it's actually put in the temple of their god. All kinds of terrible things happen to the Philistines. They are struck with boils and so on, and they finally send the ark out and abandon it. Here, it's the opposite. The person whose house this is blessed in all kinds of ways. So David understands now that God will allow this, and he brings it from the house to the city of David amidst rejoicing it. And when the ark of God had moved 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. And here we get really a great scene. He whirls with all his might before God. He was girt with a linen ephod. And David and all the house of Israel brought the ark of God with shouts and blasts of the horn. So this scene of David dancing wildly, right? And presumably his linen ephod, his skirts are going up, right? But this is a kind of religious ecstasy that he is in. He's overcome by the moment. He's just so happy to be able to not only make Jerusalem the political center, but also the spiritual center of his kingdom. And now Saul's daughter, Michal, who he had married, and in fact, that was, the promise, right? That the champion who defeated Goliath would marry the king's daughter, and she sees him and she despises him for it. Notice that she is looking out a window, right? She didn't go. And we'll see in a minute that perhaps she thought it was beneath her dignity. And she sees him, and they bring the Ark of the Covenant and set it up in its place inside the tent that David had pitched. And he again sacrifices offerings of well-being, burnt offerings. And when he finished, he blessed the people in the name of the God of hosts. He distributed among the people to each a loaf of bread, a cake made in a pan, a raisin cake, right? There's a little kiddish afterwards, and they go home. And he goes home. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, notice the emphasis, comes out to meet David, and she says, didn't the king of Israel do himself honor today, exposing himself in the sight of maidservants as one of the riffraff might expose himself? And David says, it was before God who chose me instead of your father and all his family and appointed me a ruler over Israel, God's people. I will dance before God and dishonor myself even more and be low in my own esteem. But among the maidservants that you speak of, I will be honored. So to her dying day, Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children. So I love this scene, first of all, because the sense of her sense that the king must be dignified. Her father, who was like that. We had a sense he was tall and so on. We don't get a sense, by the way, of that dignity when he's at Endor. And he immediately responds, who chose me over your father and appointed me ruler of Israel. And then he said, I will dishonor myself even more and be low in my own esteem. And this is a really interesting statement. But among the maidservants that you speak of, I will be honored. He is in sense saying, this is a way of consolidating power. I will appear to be like them. I'll be a man of the people, in addition to the fact that dancing before God is in a kind of religious ecstasy and joy, shows him in his spiritual light, this exuberance. And so right here, you see both elements of David's leadership. And then this last line, so to her dying day, she had no children. Not everybody agrees, but I read this as saying he never slept with her again. that this is his response to her condemning him for not being dignified enough. Okay, I will stop my share. Okay, folks, what do you make of this? Sandy.
Oh, the incident with the wagon and catching the ark, I find very upsetting, very disturbing. I'm not sure why you would connect it with the strange fire, because this was And I think of the Torah in the synagogue, if it starts to fall, everybody runs to catch it. I just find, I mean, and God, was there any warning? Did God say, if you do this, you're going to die? It seems God just decides at will, I don't know, is the word capricious? I'm not sure what that means. Does that mean, is that the
God
right word?
does God does what God chooses to do, right? And
Yeah,
yes, there's no warning.
but
So
what sort of God would do
okay,
something? I mean,
all
it's
right.
hard. Who would want? I'm sorry, but how can you pray to a God who just decides, here you are, your intentions are good. Was there any warning? And then he's struck dead. I mean, he
Yes,
doesn't get another
right,
chance. He doesn't get anything.
right. Yes. So I two things. One is that first of all, there's no time for warning, right?
So I
But
mean,
beyond,
before that, was it
yes, but
like a week?
beyond that, I think the idea that the ark is sacred, and going back to what I said before about the tent in the wilderness and no one's allowed to touch it directly, one might assume, though there's no evidence that people should know this. But beyond that, I read this in the same way that I read what happens at Sinai, that God sends Moses down and he says to the people, make sure that the boundary, to Moses, make sure that the boundaries are clear, that the people not come up on the mountain, lest I break out against them. That really here, there's something automatic about this. No, I know that's not what the text says, right? The text emphasizes that God got angry, right? But uh, you know, and you can interpret it to the extent, I mean, we have an author who's telling this story, right? Um, if there is truth to this incident, which is not clear at all that there is, right? But if there is, I choose to see it uh, rather as something automatic, something that happens when you get too close to the holy and you actually touch it. Um, but yes, it's disturbing. And Sandy, I have to say, knowing you, I anticipated that you would say this. It's completely consistent, but
Thank you.
be that as it may. Any other comments or thoughts about this scene? Um, this idea of being, overcome with joy and ecstasy and all of that resonates deeply with me. And really ever since Shlomo Carlebach's tunes have been incorporated in Kabbalat Shabbat, and there's in many communities, a tradition grew up of people during the singing starting to dance, right? Which exuberantly, right? Which I've always loved, right? That the idea that you don't have to be completely dignified. That synagogue is about sensing God's presence. And here David is swept up in it. And I think when we go to shul sometimes, that's what we want. We want to have that sense almost of being swept up in it. And certainly, Korbach's melodies in particular, I think, um, tend to do that. But that's only my own personal way of relating to this story. Francesca.
Well, on that note, I know we've told you that we used to be members of BJ in the City on 88 between Broadway and West End. So if
Yeah.
ever you want to give yourself a treat, that's what they do Friday night. You find a place that you can sleep over, so you can walk to shul, and then you get to dance on Shabbos, which we
I know
always did. I always adored
I
it.
have been there.
I thought
Was
so.
was
For
there
anyone
many
else
years
who's
ago.
listening,
Yeah.
it's such a wonderful celebration for Shabbat.
True enough. Barry.
Yeah, I had a reaction similar to Sandy's, and there's a line from Shakespeare's King Lear, as flies to wanton boys, so are men to the gods.
Yes.
And it,
But yes.
and if I am killing a spider that's in the house. I'll often think of that line. The spider has no idea what's about to happen, just to wiped out, and that so person could uh, die somewhat suddenly.
Yes. Um, First of all, I like the fact you're quoting Shakespeare. I've already talked about Homer
Right.
and Ulysses, so we're really moving into the Western canon. Yeah, I look. Um, I think there's a difference, right, between the gods that are being invoked uh, there, because pagan gods are capricious, right, and they do what they do. Um, And I agree that this is troubling. I will say that part of the move from biblical literature to rabbinic literature is a kind of rejection of this view of God. I, you know, each here, each period in Jewish history conceptualizes God a little bit differently. We'll see that, by the way, in very dramatic terms with Elijah, because I want to look not only at Elijah as Elijah appears in the Bible, but how Elijah appears in rabbinic literature. And you'll see for the rabbis, he's a completely different kind of figure. And I think God is a personality here. Um, there is something uncanny about God. We can't really know. God God does as God chooses. Even in rabbinic literature, you remember, because I've related this story of how Moses sits in he wants to see Akiva, and he goes and he sits in the last row of his Beit Midrash, his study house, and he's overwhelmed by Akiva's knowledge. He feels inferior, in fact, to Akiva's knowledge of Torah as it's developed. And he says, show me his reward. And Akiva is martyred. And Moses says, such is his Torah and such is his reward, right? So even in rabbinic literature, we have this sense that, what the suffering of the innocent, right, is a primary problem in theodicy. And we look at it in our own world. Why does God allow it? Here, God does it, and that's different. But it's a matter of degree rather than kind, I think, actually. Anything else? We're really out of time. Okay, two more, Saul, and then I'll come back to you, Barry.
I was thinking of Michal, okay,
Yes.
comparing her with the Imahot. The Imahot basically did nothing wrong, and they were deprived of children
Right.
until such time as God let them have the children. But here we have a woman with a little bit more chutzpah, I guess you want to say, and no children. That's it.
Yes. So, and that is the other interpretation. The other interpretation is, in fact, that, she is going to be barren because of what happened. In other words, that it's God's verdict, essentially. Because David is God's champion, and David here was worshiping God, making sacrifices, right? Throwing himself into religious ecstasy. And so, but I like the more cynical view. And that is, she had no children. It's clear, it doesn't say, and David never slept with her again. It doesn't say that, right? All it says is that she didn't have children. The matriarchs are barren in some ways because that gives us a sense of really the miraculous nature of God and what happens. Here, I don't think so. But again, this is again the way the two-sided way of reading this story. If you read the stories of David in toto, um, you come away with this idea that he is a skilled and conniving politician and also this religious figure. And I think you see it here too. Anyway, yeah, I see it as, measure for measure in some ways. You have disgraced yourself among these women. All right, I won't disgrace myself with you. I won't. You let them see your nakedness. You're not going to see mine again. That's sort of how I read it. But your reading, Saul, is absolutely legitimate, and there are lots of commentaries who say that. Lots of commentaries. Okay, Barry, last comment.
Yes, yeah, I'm glad Saul mentioned Michal, because my comment is related to her. So in history, there's a concept of dynasty, which, so there's a inherited kingship based upon heredity, right? So Michal is the daughter of Saul. So by her not having children and any offspring of David, and now hereditarily distinct from Saul. So so the kingship of David and his descendants represent a separate dynasty.
That's great. I think that's really an interesting idea. It's something I had not considered. The question is, and it may not, I'm going to check, right? Does Saul, well, I mean, we do know we know Jonathan, of course, who is the son of Saul, who one of the things about Jonathan is that he is totally dedicated to David and to David's kingship. I don't know. It's an interesting question, one I want to look at more clearly to see, is this really this is the end of Saul's line? I'm not sure. Certainly Saul loses the kingship. I'm also not sure, because we don't get to find out whether the kingship is meant to be dynastic in Saul's time, right? In David's time, it's clear, and God says that. I don't know if it's true of Saul. I don't know if that idea, now it may just have been inherent. In other words, to be king means that your children will also be king, right? Could be. On the other hand, I'm not sure. I thank you for raising it. I think it's a really important question. I'm going to look into it a little bit.
We certainly can expect the Messiah to come through the line of David.
Yes, yes. And in fact, well, I'll have more to say about that later on. Okay. Well,
thank you.
Good to see you all. And we will continue a little bit with David. 2 more scenes from his life. And we'll do that next week. If anyone is interested, you could. I am speaking at our synagogue this Shabbat. So if you want to tune in, feel free. Okay. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good